My name is Ethan Marlowe, and if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes, it's served in the shape of a family dinner in a glass of Cabernet, in the way your mother sets down her knife and fork before turning to you with that rehearsed surgical calm only she could master. That was the night everything changed. The night they declared war. Not against a rival, not against the press, not even against another political dynasty, but against their own blood. Against me. We were seated in the dining room of our cliffside estate overlooking the Pacific, a place where sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows like liquid gold. It should have been peaceful. It should have felt like home. But the tension that evening could have cracked the marble beneath our feet. My brother Nathan sat across from me, his jaw tight, eyes cool and unreadable. My sister, Juliet, toyed with her wine glass, silent but alert, like a predator waiting for the first sign of weakness. Then Mother leaned forward, elbows barely touching the tablecloth, and said the words that landed like a thunderclap inside my chest. "We've made a decision," she said. "Your father and I have agreed. It's time." Time. I looked up from my untouched plate, confused. Father didn't speak at first. He simply adjusted the French cuff of his shirt, the engraved gold button winking under the chandelier light. "We're staging a succession," Mother continued, her voice silk over steel. "One of you will take over the family legacy. The political machine we've spent 3 decades constructing needs a face for the next generation." I blinked, trying to process what I was hearing. The Marlowe legacy wasn't just about wealth. It was power, influence, control. Our name opened doors in Washington, sent whispers through Capitol Hill, and lobbied bills before they even had signatures. My parents weren't politicians, they were kingmakers. And now they were looking for an heir. Before I could speak, she added the condition. "The rule is simple," she said. "Win the mayoral race in San Diego. That's the proving ground. Whoever claims the office inherits the empire. Money, assets, everything." A chill passed through me. I waited for the rest. Surely this was a joke, a test of character, some cruel lesson in ambition. But then she turned to me and her eyes, those precise, calculating eyes, met mine. "Ethan," she said, her voice low, unwavering. "You're not capable. This role, it isn't for you." Each word carved into me like a blade. "You don't have the instinct," she went on. "The killer edge. We've watched you. You hesitate. You feel too much. In this world, that's a liability." And then Father finally spoke, gesturing toward Nathan without even glancing my way. "Nathan was born for this," he said. "He knows how to lead. He's got the spine, the ruthlessness." He paused. "You write essays. Play piano. Read philosophy. That's not leadership. That's indulgence." I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks. My throat tightened, but I didn't speak. I couldn't. Somewhere in the room, Juliet chuckled under her breath, then quickly covered it with a sip of wine. They didn't want me to try. They wanted me to not try. They were daring me to walk away, to accept the label they had chosen for me. Soft. Weak. Unworthy. In that moment I understood something that would haunt me for weeks after. That this wasn't just a contest. It was an execution. A way to surgically remove me from the line of succession under the guise of competition. I looked at Nathan. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He knew the game was already rigged in his favor. Father had spent years molding him into his image. Cold, calculating, efficient. Nathan had interned at the State Department at 16, dined with senators by 18, and by 22 was already managing black budget PACs for candidates across the West Coast. I had watched him rise, always from the sidelines, always with a strange mix of pride and dread. Now I realized, I was never even in the same race. But something inside me shifted that night. Not rage. Not desperation. Something quieter. Colder. I didn't lash out or plead my case. I excused myself from the table, my stomach untouched, my hands trembling beneath the linen napkin I carefully set beside the plate. I walked out of that room knowing one thing. They had declared war and they believed I was already defeated. They were wrong. My parents didn't just choose a favorite. They invested in one. Nathan became the embodiment of everything they believed in, their golden son, their weapon sharpened by years of careful conditioning and endless opportunity. The moment they announced the so-called contest, it became brutally clear that it was never meant to be fair. They gave him everything. A sprawling campaign headquarters in the Gaslamp Quarter, lined with walnut paneling and smart glass walls. A full-time staff of seasoned political strategists, image consultants, speechwriters and media handlers. Direct access to donors, lobbyists and elite backroom alliances forged through decades of quiet power plays. Meanwhile, I was handed the equivalent of a pat on the head and sent off to figure things out on my own. No introductions, no funding, no press team. Just a vague reminder that I had a scholarship covering my last year at UCSD and a key to a dorm room barely big enough for a bed and a desk. My father made it sound like an act of mercy when he said, "We're letting you learn self-reliance." What he meant was, survive if you can, fail if you must, but don't expect us to clean up after you. They didn't even try to hide it. The disparity was so glaring, so humiliating, it bordered on sadistic. Every press release about Nathan's campaign was glowing, amplified by journalists already on our family payroll. Photos of him kissing babies, shaking hands with union leaders, standing in front of flag-draped stages. All carefully choreographed and funded with a bottomless account my parents had quietly opened for him the day after the announcement. His commercials aired during prime time. His face was plastered across billboards that blinked down over freeways. He even had a custom-designed campaign logo, sleek and minimalist, complete with a slogan that sounded like it had been test-marketed by a dozen focus groups. A stronger San Diego begins with strength at the top. Me. I was printing flyers at a 24-hour copy center, using design templates I found online and a 10-year-old version of Photoshop. My campaign meetings took place in a borrowed study room at the university library, under flickering fluorescent lights and the constant hum of vending machines. My team consisted of a political science major named Kelsey who volunteered because she needed credit hours, and an old friend from high school who delivered food during the day and helped me build a website at night using a free platform that crashed at least once a week. I had no speechwriter, no media handler, no donors. Just a voice, a handful of ideas, and a growing fire in my chest that I didn't know how to put out. What made it worse, more painful than the logistics or the humiliation, was the way they dismissed the rest of us entirely. My younger brother Ryan, barely 17, was told not to interfere, and reminded that his time would come if he stayed in line. My sister Leah, who once organized statewide protests against voter suppression, was dismissed as too emotional and unfocused. My mother barely acknowledged her when she raised the idea of running. She simply said, "We need someone the public can take seriously, Leah. Not another cause crusader." We were all collateral damage, written off as statistical noise in the equation of their master plan. At family dinners, what few remained, the air turned acidic. The unspoken truths hung above us like chandeliers made of glass and tension. Nathan sat at the head of the table now, not our father who preferred to observe from the shadows. He answered questions about polling numbers, policy platforms, and media appearances while the rest of us sat in uncomfortable silence. I remember Leah once daring to ask why father hadn't contributed to a local grassroots campaign she'd helped organize, and he responded with a smile so thin it might as well have been a paper cut. Because symbolism doesn't win elections, sweetheart. Strategy does. The gap between us grew so fast, so aggressively, that I began to feel like I was living in two separate realities. One was Nathan's world. Polished, controlled, fed by millions of dollars and fortified by a team of people whose sole purpose was to make him invincible. The other was mine. Chaotic, unstable, running on ramen noodles, unpaid favors, and long nights filled with the dull ache of being underestimated by everyone who had once called themselves my family. But the worst part, the part one still struggled to say out loud, was how deeply personal it became. This wasn't just about politics. It wasn't even about money, though $60 million hung in the air like a gold noose. It was about erasure. About being told in 1,000 different ways that you don't matter. That you're not enough. That everything you are, your voice, your vision, your conviction, is a liability to be managed, not a force to be supported. There were days I'd wake up wondering why I was still trying. Why I kept fighting in a war I wasn't meant to survive. But then I'd hear Nathan on the radio, rehearsed and robotic, echoing talking points someone else had written, and I'd feel the heat come back. Because if I let them win, if I accepted that I was just a failed prototype in the Marlow assembly line, then they were right. And I couldn't live with that. Our family was unraveling, thread by bitter thread. We'd been dressed in the costume of unity for so long that no one had noticed how hollow we'd become inside. But now the seams were bursting. And beneath the expensive fabric, all that remained was ambition, resentment, and a deep, cutting silence that none of us could bear to break. The day we signed the new financial agreements was the day I finally understood the full scope of my parents' cruelty. They didn't just withdraw support, they redefined it, weaponized it, turned it into a currency of control that reached into every corner of our lives. The documents were dressed up in legal language, thick with formality and vague terms like performance-based disbursements and discretionary allocations. But the reality was much simpler. Money became a leash. They had built a system where every dollar came with strings, and every string led back to their judgment of our obedience. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about behavior. Dignity. Compliance. The new structure, as they called it, placed each of us under scrutiny. They created a private rubric, An invisible evaluation system that measured not just our achievements but our attitude. Were we cooperative? Did we align with their vision? Did we represent the family name in a way that reflected positively on them? If the answer was yes, we received our monthly support. If not, the payments dwindled or disappeared altogether. It didn't take long for the message to sink in. If you resisted, you starved. Not literally, we still had roofs over our heads, but emotionally, socially, creatively. My younger brother Ryan felt it first and hardest. Ryan was always the artist, the dreamer. He had this raw, aching talent that came out through music. Complex piano compositions, abstract soundscapes he built from analog equipment he repaired himself. For years he played not to impress but to survive the noise in his own head. He had something rare, something honest. But honesty had no value in our parents' world. If it couldn't be packaged, sold, or leveraged for influence, it was useless. When the new system rolled out, Ryan's funding was slashed without warning. My father said it was because Ryan's pursuits lacked market viability. My mother, always more elegant in her cruelty, said, "It's important he learns that passion without profit is just self-indulgence." Those words destroyed him. He didn't argue, he never did, but I saw the shift immediately. His laughter faded. The piano in the west wing of the house fell silent. He began to avoid eye contact, conversations, even daylight. One evening I found him sitting on the floor of his bedroom, surrounded by torn-up sheet music. Crumpled pages littered the carpet, some stained with coffee, others ripped clean down the middle. He didn't look up when I walked in. I asked him what he was doing and he said quietly, "They can't judge what they can't see." He'd started hiding his compositions, locking away his notebooks, saving audio files on encrypted drives he buried inside folders labeled with schoolwork and tax documents. Not because he feared theft, but because he feared humiliation. Every time he showed them something real, they crushed it under the weight of their indifference. So he stopped showing them anything at all. I watched my brother's soul shrink in real time. His once boundless creativity curled in on itself, like a plant denied light. And the worst part was he wasn't alone. We were all adjusting in our own ways. Leah, ever the fighter, began censoring herself in conversations with our parents. She toned down her rhetoric, stopped talking about activism, replaced her social justice work with more acceptable forms of volunteerism, charity galas, donor events, photo ops. She smiled through clenched teeth, wore the dresses our mother chose, learned to keep her edge hidden under layers of diplomacy. She hated every second of it, but she played the game because she had to. As for me, I walked a tightrope. I couldn't afford to fall into total rebellion, not if I wanted to stay in the race. But I also refused to become Nathan's shadow, or worse, his echo. Every conversation with our parents felt like a performance, every phone call a negotiation. They'd ask how the campaign was going and I'd have to decide whether to tell the truth about the lack of funding, the logistical nightmares, the emotional exhaustion, or to pretend to fabricate signs of progress, to keep the illusion alive just long enough to stay relevant in their eyes. We lived in a system where love was conditional and loyalty was currency, where the line between support and surveillance blurred more with each passing day. I began to suspect that nothing we did went unnoticed, that our movements, our calls, our meetings were monitored. I once found a strange device under my desk, something that looked like a signal receiver. When I confronted Father, he shrugged and said, "We have to protect our investments." I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. This wasn't a family anymore. It was a corporation. A machine. A brutal meritocracy designed to reward those who conformed and punish those who questioned. And the terrifying part was how easy it was to start internalizing the logic. How quickly you began to measure your worth in dollars and influence, in favors granted or withheld. How silence became a survival strategy and authenticity a liability. Ryan stopped playing for us. Leah stopped speaking her mind. And I, day by day, began to feel the walls closing in. Not physical walls, but the kind you build inside yourself when you realize that every expression, every word, every choice you make might be used against you. And still somehow we kept going. Because hope in its most twisted form still flickered in each of us. Hope that maybe, just maybe, if we endured long enough we could still win. Not just the inheritance but something deeper. Something resembling freedom. The cracks in our family weren't sudden explosions. They were slow, quiet fractures, the kind that spread beneath the surface until everything finally collapsed under the weight of denial. Leah had always been the most vocal among us, the one who challenged our parents openly without fear or hesitation. But over time even her voice began to soften, not out of defeat but out of exhaustion. I saw it in the way her shoulders slumped after phone calls with our mother, in the way her laughter, once sharp and defiant, turned brittle like glass moments before shattering. She was in her final year of law school when the next phase of their manipulation began. Our mother called it strategic matchmaking, but there was nothing romantic about it. It was an arrangement, a transaction dressed up in the language of legacy and opportunity. They set her up with Lucas Hale, the son of Senator Ronald Hale, a man who had been orbiting our family's political sphere for years, their hands shaking over fundraising dinners, their names paired in headlines like rival monarchs co-authoring history. The union, in our mother's eyes, would strengthen the brand, consolidate power, and signal loyalty to the old guard that still held sway in D.C. Leah despised Lucas. Not in the theatrical way people claim to hate someone after a bad date, but with a visceral, bone-deep disgust. He was the embodiment of everything she rejected: arrogant, performative, allergic to principle, and so used to getting what he wanted that he mistook compliance for affection. He spoke in polished sound bites, called her sweetheart during policy debates, and once told her that student activism was cute but ineffective. And yet she kept seeing him. Week after week. At first it was brunches at hotel rooftops, then charity events, then private dinners where her presence was photographed and circulated through political gossip columns with captions speculating about the next great power couple. Behind closed doors she crumbled. One night, long after midnight, I found her in the common room of my dorm, sitting cross-legged on the couch, arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes red from holding back too many things for too long. She looked up when I entered but didn't smile. "Don't say anything," she whispered before I could speak. I sat next to her in silence, waiting. Eventually she leaned in close, her voice almost inaudible. "Ethan, they're selling me," she said. "They're using me like a chip on a negotiation table. They don't care if I hate him. They don't even care if he respects me. They just want the picture. The name. The alliance." I didn't know what to say. Because she was right. Every time she voiced discomfort about Lucas, our mother countered with logic so cold and calculated it could have come from a boardroom. "He's from a good family, Leah. He can open doors for you. You'll grow to appreciate what he offers. You don't need to love him. You need to build something with him." Every protest Leah made was treated as a sign of immaturity, a deviation from the plan. And deviation meant risk. And risk in our family meant consequences. Sure enough, a week after she skipped one of their scheduled dinners, her tuition disbursement was delayed. Then her apartment rent mysteriously doubled. Our parents had been subsidizing it through a third-party holding company, and without warning they pulled the support. She started couchsurfing, borrowing money in small amounts from friends she swore she'd repay by semester's end. She tried to fight back at first. She emailed law professors asking for grant extensions. She picked up side work, editing contracts, reviewing briefs, even ghostwriting legal memos for low-level firms willing to pay in cash. But the message had been sent loud and clear. Loyalty to the family plan was the only insurance against collapse. I watched her shrink just like Ryan had. The same brightness dimming behind her eyes. The same strategic silences replacing the fire that once defined her. She no longer argued during family calls. She played her role, answered questions in safe, rehearsed phrases, smiled at the right moments when Lucas's name came up. But in private she began disappearing. Missing class. Ignoring messages. Drinking more than usual. Once she left me a voicemail. 2 minutes of nothing but breathing and quiet sobbing before it cut off. It became obvious that our parents weren't raising children anymore. They were grooming assets. They believed love was transactional, that affection could be negotiated like policy, that loyalty was just another form of investment return. And when any of us pushed back they reminded us, subtly, efficiently, how easily we could be replaced or erased. Leah never told me exactly what finally made her give in. Maybe it was the day she came home to find eviction papers taped to her door. Maybe it was when she opened her student account and saw a negative balance where her stipend used to be. Or maybe it was just the slow erosion of hope, the quiet realization that fighting them alone was like throwing stones into a tidal wave. But from that moment on, I knew the truth with a clarity I hadn't before. They didn't just want to control us, they wanted to reshape us in their image piece by piece until nothing authentic remained. They wanted us obedient, polished, useful. And when Leah whispered those words to me that night, "They're selling me," it wasn't just her voice I heard. It was all of ours. All the pieces of ourselves we had to bury just to survive. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to see things for what they truly were. For months I kept trying to find meaning in the way they treated us, hoping that underneath all the control, the cold strategy, the silent punishments, there was still some trace of love, some remnant of family. I told myself this was just their way of preparing us for the real world. That maybe after the race ended we'd come back together, bruised but still whole. I clung to that illusion like a life raft. Until one day it slipped from my grip completely, and I was left treading water in the cold clarity of what they had built. This wasn't a contest. It was a system of destruction. Every decision they made, every rule they set, every quiet consequence, They weren't tools to shape us into better people. They were instruments of control, sharpened over decades of manipulation, wielded without hesitation or guilt. The truth was brutal in its simplicity. They didn't see us as children. They saw us as assets. Categories on a spreadsheet. Variables in a long-term strategy. And somewhere along the way they stopped pretending otherwise. Nathan was the primary instrument. He had always been. From the beginning they shaped him into the public face of the empire. The polished jawline, the decisive handshake, the carefully rehearsed voice that could speak in perfect bipartisan platitudes. He wasn't just their son. He was their extension, a walking embodiment of their ambition. They poured everything into him because he was useful. He delivered. He didn't question, didn't resist. He adapted, he performed, and he gave them returns. To them, that was love. A perfectly executed role in their machine. Leah, in contrast, became diplomatic currency. She was never meant to lead but to connect, to soften edges, to charm allies, to stand at the side of someone more capable. When she challenged that role, they punished her not with words but with silence, with withdrawal. Then when she complied, they pushed her deeper into the transactional nightmare they called strategy. Dinners with senators' sons, photo ops with polished smiles, alliances crafted through marriage proposals. Her intellect was tolerated only as long as it served their broader narrative. And when it didn't, it was discarded like an outdated script. Ryan, sweet and strange and brilliant in ways they never cared to understand, was labeled a failed investment. His music, his expression, his sensitivity, they couldn't monetize it, and so they saw it as waste. They withheld support not to motivate him but to erase him. He became the family's cautionary tale. This is what happens when you deviate too far from the plan. He lived in quiet exile, surrounded by the pieces of himself he wasn't allowed to show. And me, well, I was the failed prototype. The one they had once imagined as a possibility, but who had quickly proven too unpredictable, too reluctant, too human. I was the blurry line between what they expected and what they got. I thought for a time that I could win their respect through persistence, through a quiet kind of endurance. That if I proved myself on my own terms, they'd see value in that. But now I understood. They didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to disappear without making noise. I had become a liability they were too proud to erase publicly, and too indifferent to support privately. They built a world in which success required submission, where autonomy was a threat, and where love had been redefined as performance. But I had seen enough. I had watched Leah fold herself into a role she despised. I had seen Ryan shrink until his voice barely filled a room. I had seen Nathan become a product, sold and distributed with the precision of a campaign slogan. And I had lived too long inside the lie that any of this could be changed by playing by their rules. So I made a decision. I would no longer follow their script. I would no longer measure my worth by their approval or their funding or their silence. I wouldn't fight for a place at their table, I would overturn it. Because if we were all just assets, then it was time I stopped pretending I was broken. I wasn't a failed project. I was an anomaly. I wasn't designed to survive their system. I was built to dismantle it. And to do that, I had to stop seeking redemption from people who never offered love without a price tag. For the first time, I understood my role with complete clarity. And I wasn't going to play it. I was going to rewrite it. When I officially registered my candidacy for the mayoral race in San Diego, I knew I wasn't doing it to win. At least, not in the way my parents defined victory. They believed in outcomes measured in votes, influence, wealth, and obedience. For them, the election was a stage, a proving ground, a ritual where the strongest asset could emerge as heir to the empire. But for me, submitting that paperwork was something entirely different. It was infiltration. It was the first step in gaining access to the arteries of the machine they had spent their entire lives building. I wasn't stepping into the arena to compete. I was stepping into it to study, to expose, and eventually to dismantle. Behind the campaign slogans and polished press releases, our family business wasn't just about politics. It was a labyrinth of private arrangements, off-book contributions, quiet partnerships with corporations, and favors exchanged across borders and agencies. I knew just enough to understand there was more hidden beneath the surface than anyone outside the family could guess. And I suspected that the contest they had orchestrated among us wasn't about succession. It was about control. It was about ensuring that whatever secrets were buried within the empire stayed there, untouched, preserved by loyalty and fear. So I began documenting everything. Not the campaign statistics or polling numbers. That didn't matter to me. I started a separate journal, encrypted, buried deep in a hidden drive, where I kept track of every incident, every conversation, every quiet punishment disguised as financial restructuring. I called it the conditional abuse log because that's exactly what it was. A record of the coercive architecture they had built to keep us in line. I noted the day Leah's stipend was slashed following her refusal to attend a gala with Lucas Hale. I included the exact wording of the email she received from our mother, masked in corporate tone, stating that her performance evaluation had led to a temporary suspension of discretionary funds. I wrote down how Ryan's access to the family trust was quietly revoked after he shared a private track of his music with a local community project, an act my parents deemed public exposure without strategic consultation. Each entry became more detailed, more disturbing. The pattern was unmistakable: reward compliance, punish deviation, manipulate through scarcity. My parents had built an internal economy where love was measured in allowances, and value was tied directly to utility. It was never about growth or support. It was about reinforcement. And like any system built on manipulation, it required silence and isolation to survive. But I refused to be silent anymore. I started interviewing people, not formally but through conversations that I subtly guided. Old staff members, former consultants, family advisors who had retired or been pushed out. I asked careful questions, letting them think I was trying to emulate my father's methods, seeking advice on leadership. Some of them were eager to talk, mistaking me for a younger version of him. They dropped hints, made references to internal audits that had never been filed, campaign donations that were funneled through third-party charitable arms, influence maps that connected our family name to judges, prosecutors, and zoning boards. I took notes after every meeting, every call, careful not to draw suspicion. At the same time, I kept playing the role of the underdog candidate. I showed up to debates. I shook hands at farmers markets. I gave interviews that sounded earnest, humble, unthreatening. It helped that my parents underestimated me completely. They believed I was clinging to the race out of desperation, out of some need to prove myself before I inevitably bowed out. That gave me cover. While Nathan's team was busy polishing his image and steamrolling local endorsements, I was quietly tracing the veins of a much older, deeper structure. And the deeper I looked, the more I found. My father once told me politics was a game of angles, that everything depended on how you presented a shadow, not how you cast it. But I wasn't interested in casting shadows. I wanted light. I wanted the truth, not the version they curated, but the raw, unfiltered anatomy of the empire they ruled. I wanted to know how many people had been bought, how many silenced, how many like us, like Leah and Ryan, had been broken quietly under the weight of expectations they never consented to carry. Every piece of information I gathered was a thread. And every thread led to something else. Contracts, shell companies, investments made in the names of political figures' spouses, real estate held by foundations with no websites or boards. I wasn't just exposing a family. I was uncovering a network. But through it all, I didn't forget the most important part: the people they had turned into pawns. My siblings. Leah, who had once dreamed of running her own nonprofit but now spent her days reciting talking points to maintain her value score. Ryan, who composed entire symphonies no one would ever hear because our parents had convinced him his art was shameful. Even Nathan, for all his privilege and favor, wasn't free. He was imprisoned in expectation, in a persona so thoroughly manufactured that I wasn't sure he even knew who he was beneath the campaign suit. They had turned us all into pieces on a board, and the board itself was rigged. So I made a choice not just to play, but to upend the game entirely. And the first step was to collect the truth, piece by piece, until the illusion of control they wielded began to crack. I wasn't campaigning for a title. I was preparing for a confrontation. And I knew it was coming. Ryan's collapse didn't come suddenly. It was a slow disintegration, a quiet unraveling that began in ways so small we barely noticed until it was too late. He had been withdrawing for months, his presence in the house fading like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Conversations became shorter, his answers quieter, his laughter extinct. He stopped showing up for family calls, avoided texts, ignored emails. At first, I told myself he was just taking space, trying to find his rhythm after yet another round of humiliation. But deep down I knew better. I recognized the hollow in his voice, the exhaustion that seeps into the bones when someone stops believing there's any way out. He was always the most fragile of us, not because he was weak but because he felt everything too deeply. Ryan's heart was porous. He absorbed the world, its beauty and its cruelty, until it drowned him. And in a family like ours, empathy was treated like an infection. My parents saw his sensitivity as a defect, something to be medicated, disciplined, starved out. Every time he hesitated, every time he faltered, they called it proof of his failure. When he couldn't deliver, when he didn't meet their impossible standards, they reminded him that he was non-performing. It wasn't a word meant for a son. It was a term from a quarterly report. But that was how they spoke about him. That was how they measured his worth. The last few weeks before it happened, I had started to see signs that terrified me. His messages came at strange hours. 2:47 a.m., 4:12 a.m., short, disconnected phrases like, "It doesn't matter anymore," or "They were right about me." Once he sent a photo of torn sheet music on his floor. Another time, just a black square with the words, "No sound left." I tried to call him, but he wouldn't answer. When I finally decided to drive to his apartment, the silence in the hallway felt wrong, thick and electric. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something bitter beneath it, something like metal and despair. I knocked. No response. I pushed open the door, it wasn't locked, and found him on the floor beside his bed, a half-empty bottle of sedatives tipped onto the carpet, pills scattered like pale beads across the wood. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow but present. He looked at me without surprise, as if he had expected me to find him, as if this was the inevitable end to a story he had already written in his head. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, cracked and distant, like it belonged to someone already fading. "They were right," he whispered. "I'm nothing. It's better now than later." The words hit me like a physical blow. I dropped to my knees and grabbed his shoulders, shaking him, begging him to stay awake. I kept saying his name over and over like repetition could hold him in the world. He cried, but there were no tears, just the sound of breathing turning uneven. I called an ambulance with one hand while holding his wrist with the other, feeling his pulse flutter weakly like a trapped bird. The minutes stretched into years until the paramedics arrived. They saved him. Barely. I stayed by his side in the hospital through the night, listening to the steady rhythm of machines keeping him tethered to life. His face was pale, almost translucent in the sterile light, and for a moment he looked like the child he used to be, the boy who once built a cardboard piano because he wasn't allowed to touch the family's grand one. That boy had dreamed of playing music that would make people feel seen. And now, lying there, he was the proof of how thoroughly they could break someone with that same sensitivity. When my parents found out, their reaction was not grief. It was disgust. My mother didn't ask if he was alive. She asked if the hospital had called the press. My father said, "This kind of weakness costs reputation." They talked about him like he was a liability. And then came the final insult, the punishment. They lowered his family's score by 25 points, citing emotional instability and non-compliance with treatment protocol. I remember the way they said it, like it was administrative housekeeping, like his pain was a failure of discipline instead of evidence of their cruelty. Something inside me broke then. Not like Ryan. His fracture was visible, mine was silent, but it was real and irreversible. I realized that this wasn't just a toxic family. It was a cult disguised as a dynasty. A hierarchy built on obedience, worship and fear, all enforced through the language of performance and loyalty. We weren't children, we were disciples. Our parents didn't raise us, they indoctrinated us. Every rule, every punishment, every so-called evaluation was a ritual meant to keep us from questioning the sanctity of the system. They had turned devotion into currency, love into leverage. And when one of us faltered, they didn't offer help, they offered correction. To them, Ryan's collapse wasn't tragedy. It was proof that the system worked. Proof that deviation led to destruction, that independence was fatal. But as I watched my brother sleep, breathing shallowly through the night, I understood something they never could. They thought they had broken him, but they hadn't. What they had done, what they kept doing, was expose themselves. Every act of cruelty was another crack in their illusion of control. Every scar they left behind was evidence. Evidence I was now collecting, not just for my journal, not just for revenge, but for truth. Because when Ryan whispered that he was nothing, what he really revealed was what they had tried to make all of us believe. That without their approval we ceased to exist. That night, sitting in that cold hospital chair, I decided to prove them wrong. And for the first time I felt no fear of what would come next. Only resolve. I had spent weeks trying to piece together the structure of our family's hidden empire, following threads of inconsistencies, whispers from discarded staff, unexplained accounts and legal blind spots. But it wasn't until I turned my attention inward, back to the one place I had avoided the longest, that I finally found it. My father's office. It wasn't just a room. It was a fortress of control, filled with polished wood, books he didn't read and trophies he didn't win. Everything inside it was curated, sterile, intimidating by design. The desk, a slab of mahogany larger than some New York apartments, sat at the heart of the room like an altar. For years, no one was allowed to touch anything without permission. But now I had access, limited but enough. I knew his habits, the codes he reused, the systems he never updated because he didn't believe anyone around him was smart enough to understand how it all worked. That arrogance became his weakest point. Tucked away in the back of a locked cabinet was an old external hard drive. It was unmarked, dusty, seemingly forgotten, like something once used regularly but then stored when cloud systems took over. I plugged it in, careful to stay offline, and what I found inside stopped my breath cold. Folders labeled with vague initials. Excel files with internal nicknames. PDFs of scanned contracts, handwritten notes, payment schedules, offshore routing numbers. But the key was a directory titled Marlowe Strategies LLC, Private Ledgers. At first glance, it looked like standard financial tracking, consulting income, political donations, logistical expenses. But the deeper I dug, the more absurd it became. Disbursements listed under charities that didn't exist. Vendor payments to LLCs with no web presence, many sharing identical mailing addresses. Inflated consulting fees paid to strategic analysts, who were, upon closer inspection, janitors or receptionists registered under different corporate names. The most damning pattern emerged when I matched campaign expenses from Nathan's mayoral run with the vendor payouts from our family's private fund. His ad buys weren't coming from donor money. His field teams weren't funded by legal contributions. His entire campaign, top to bottom, was being quietly financed through a structure of shell contracts and falsified invoices, processed through Marlowe Strategies, then reimbursed by our philanthropic foundation, an entity marketed to the public as a scholarship engine for underprivileged youth. It wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Tens of millions of dollars had passed through this system, hidden in plain sight under layers of financial abstraction. To the average auditor, it looked legitimate, clever even. But when cross-referenced with public filings, tax records, and campaign disclosures, it became undeniably clear. We were laundering political money under the guise of public service. Our so-called family fund wasn't a vault of generational wealth. It was a bleeding artery of debt and deception. It covered losses for allies, bought silence from former employees, and ensured that Nathan's image remained untouchable, even when reality cracked beneath the weight of illusion. This was never just about a campaign. It was a machine built on fraud, powered by influence and protected by legacy. And now I was holding its blueprints. I felt a hollow sickness as I scrolled through the files. There were names I recognized, former teachers who'd been promoted to consulting roles, neighborhood activists who suddenly went silent after donations, community centers that had closed mysteriously after receiving one-time grants. All of them were connected. Every action our family had taken in the public eye was quietly offset in the shadows, with dirty money and manipulation ensuring that the narrative stayed clean. For the first time, I understood the scope of the empire I had grown up inside. It wasn't just a toxic household or a broken dynasty, it was a laundering operation wrapped in American flags and handshakes, propped up by fear and silence. I stared at the screen for hours that night, documenting everything, encrypting backups, storing them in multiple places. I wasn't ready to go public, not yet. I knew how carefully my parents watched how many friends they had in high places. One wrong move and the evidence could disappear, the files could be discredited, I could be labeled a bitter son with a personal vendetta. But I also knew something else. I had the truth. And for the first time they didn't. The night of Leah's engagement party was an exercise in performance layered over agony. It was held at a private estate in La Jolla, surrounded by imported orchids, monogrammed champagne flutes, and an orchestra flown in from San Francisco. The guest list read like the donor log of a presidential campaign. Senators, executives, foreign diplomats, former judges. They all stood beneath strings of ambient lighting, clinking glasses, offering forced congratulations, as Leah smiled like a hostage blinking in code. Every detail of the evening was scripted by our mother. Every conversation a test of political fluency and family loyalty. The engagement itself was a farce, an alliance built on leverage, not love. I used the noise of it, this glittering charade, as cover. While everyone was distracted with speeches and toasts, I slipped away through the back hallway, past the staff entrance, into the narrow staircase that led down to my father's private office on the lower level. I had memorized the alarm code months ago. Nothing had changed. He never believed anyone in the family had the audacity to betray him from within. His arrogance once again was my access. The room was dim, cold, clinical. The glass walls reflected back faint echoes of the celebration upstairs. Laughs that didn't belong to us, applause that masked our silence. I sat down at his desk, pulled the encrypted flash drive from my jacket and plugged it into the tower unit beneath the desk. The hum of the processor kicked in like a low growl. My fingers moved fast, efficient, opening directories, dragging files, copying terabytes of data onto the drive. Ledgers, contracts, scanned communications, flagged donations, internal memos. Everything I had found and more. I didn't breathe until the transfer bar hit 100%. Then I yanked the flash drive, cleared the logs, powered down the system and wiped the keyboard with my sleeve. I didn't linger. I knew better. I returned to the party just as the cake was being presented. Leah was still frozen in a smile beside Lucas, her eyes hollow, her hands rigid as glass. Our mother caught my gaze from across the room and gave me a nod, misinterpreting my presence as loyalty. But I knew. I had crossed a line. There was no undoing it now. The next morning, I met with Michael Tran in the back room of a bookstore downtown. We had spoken once before, briefly, under the pretense of a university interview. But this time I handed him a flash drive in a plain black case and told him to open only the first layer. He was cautious. Journalists in our city had been manipulated before, bought out, buried under lawsuits. But as soon as he scrolled through the folder labeled Marlowe Strategies, Internal Financial Correspondence, I saw the shift in his face. He understood. By nightfall his article was live. The headline was simple but lethal: "The Golden Sun Selling San Diego." It wasn't a dramatic exposé, not at first. It was surgical. Tran laid out timelines, named shell companies, cross-referenced public campaign filings with internal payment structures from our family fund. He cited independent analysts, former staffers, and tax records that painted a damning picture of Nathan's rise to prominence. The brilliance of it was in its restraint. He didn't accuse, he revealed. He didn't speculate, he demonstrated. And the reaction was immediate. By morning, news vans were parked outside Nathan's campaign headquarters. Donor hotlines were disconnected. Former allies issued vague statements of deep concern. Anonymous sources leaked texts showing Marlowe campaign staff in full crisis mode. Nathan's media appearances were cancelled. City Hall aides whispered about investigations being reopened. And for the first time in my life, I saw panic in my father's face. The story ripped through the political landscape like a controlled detonation. Our family name, once synonymous with stability and strategy, became a liability. I watched it unfold from my dorm room, the light from my laptop screen flickering against the wall like firelight. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel relief. I felt weight, heavy, honest, and irreversible. I had launched a war not just against them, but against the very structure that raised me. There was no going back. They summoned me without ceremony, just a text from my father's assistant with the words, 11 a.m. His office, beyond time. No greeting, no context. Just a summons. The tone was unmistakable. The fallout from the article had grown too large to contain. I arrived to find both of them waiting, seated in silence like judges at a tribunal. My father stood as I entered, pacing behind his desk, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched beneath his skin. My mother sat composed, legs crossed, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression carved from stone. The door closed behind me with a heavy click, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the central air. Then my father slammed his fist onto the table with such force that a paperweight jumped and rolled across the glass surface. "You've destroyed everything we built," he barked, his voice cracking under the pressure of contained rage. "You exposed our family to public disgrace. You've turned your own brother into a punchline. Do you even understand what you've done?" He didn't wait for an answer. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the unbearable fury of a man who had always assumed control, now grappling with the realization that he had lost it. My mother didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stared at me with that piercing, glacial calm she used when she wanted to cut deeper than any scream could reach. "This," she said, her voice low and flat, "is treason. Not just against the family but against your name, your legacy, your blood. 50 points. Gone." She said it like a final judgment, like the bang of a gavel. 50 points, as if that metric still held meaning, as if my existence could be calculated through a system designed to strip us of choice and dignity. For a moment no one moved. My father's breathing was ragged, my mother's eyes unmoving, and I stood between them like a rupture in the foundation they had built. Then I spoke. "I'm not playing your game anymore." My voice was steady. "Come." And in that moment I felt something inside me close. Something final and permanent. I wasn't trying to win their approval or change their minds, or salvage some piece of love that had long since been hollowed out. I had come to deliver a message, not to negotiate. Their silence was louder than any shouting could have been. My father looked stunned, like the words didn't compute. My mother's expression didn't change, but I saw it in her eyes. The flicker of calculation, of control slipping from her fingers. I turned to leave, but before I opened the door I said one more thing. "We stopped being a family the moment you turned love into leverage. Now we're just opposing forces. And you should know, I don't lose sleep fighting people who think they own everything." No one followed me. No one called my name. I walked out of that office not as a son, not as a candidate, not as a disappointment, but as a threat. That was the moment everything changed. The illusion shattered. The myth of unity dissolved. There were no more family dinners, no more quiet compromises, no more hollow performances. There was only the truth and the fire it carried. We were no longer a family. We were enemies. The night before the election, the city hummed with tension. Radio silence from campaign headquarters, guarded press statements, last-minute ad buys flooding social media like a sinking ship's flares. But I didn't watch the headlines. I didn't meet with donors or advisors or try to salvage something through back channels. I did what I had promised myself I would do from the beginning. I made sure the truth couldn't be buried. I handed over everything. The full archive: contracts, offshore transactions, internal memos, falsified invoices, coordinated withdrawals, and undisclosed debts, went to Michael Tran in an encrypted file, along with a note that read simply, "Make it undeniable." He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He'd already seen what the first wave of documents had done. This was the final blow. 2 days later, his follow-up article went live. The headline wasn't sensational. It was surgical. Nathan Marlowe's mayoral bid, a political front for multi-million-dollar financial fraud. The timing was a scalpel to the jugular. Within hours, national outlets picked it up. The content was explosive. An evidence-based exposé mapping a trail of money laundering, fraudulent campaign funding, embezzlement through nonprofit fronts, and personal enrichment cloaked in civic language. The narrative was no longer about a son breaking away from a dynasty. It became a reckoning. A blueprint of how power hides its crimes behind polished suits, public service speeches, and family values. Sponsors began to withdraw within minutes of the article's release. Key donors issued legal statements distancing themselves from the campaign. Law firms scrambled to terminate consulting contracts. Political allies, once eager to be photographed with Nathan, pulled their endorsements and locked their phones. I received anonymous messages from former campaign staff, some thanking me, others begging for protection. My parents went silent. Completely. No press conferences. No rebuttals. No desperate counter-narratives. Just silence, the kind that follows a building collapsing in on itself. And still I didn't celebrate. I didn't stand in front of cameras or claim a moral victory. I didn't run new ads or rebrand my campaign. I didn't have the budget, and by then I didn't care to. I just kept showing up. No stage. No entourage. Just me walking through parks, markets, train stations, neighborhoods most campaigns avoided unless it was election week. I spoke to people, face to face, eye to eye. I told them what I knew. I answered their questions without scripts or handlers. I carried copies of the articles marked with the sources. I didn't spin anything. I didn't promise to fix the world. I just explained what was broken and why I refused to be part of it. Some days I stood in the rain and only 5 people stopped to listen. Other times a crowd would gather, quiet, attentive, searching my face for signs of deception they'd been trained to expect. And I gave them what no one else had: unfiltered truth. I let them decide what to believe. I wasn't trying to be a politician anymore. I had become something else entirely. A witness. A messenger. The final rupture in a dynasty built on silence. I didn't sleep the night before Election Day. I wandered the edges of the city instead, walking its streets long after the sun had disappeared behind the Pacific, past shuttered cafes, flickering street lamps, and the dull rhythm of waves crashing in the distance. It wasn't nerves. It was something deeper, something closer to disbelief. I had come this far without expecting to win. I had thrown myself into the fire not to emerge triumphant, but to burn down what needed to fall. For months I had been preparing for aftermath, not victory. By sunrise the city felt different. The air was taut, like the breath held before a verdict. I didn't have a war room, no team of analysts crunching real-time data, no strategic updates buzzing through my phone. I spent the day exactly where I began this campaign. Walking, talking, listening. A coffee shop in South Park. A farmer stand downtown. A bench near the trolley line. No cameras. No speeches. Just people and the strange, quiet bond formed by surviving the same broken systems for too long. I told myself I was ready for any result. I reminded myself that the exposure alone had been worth everything. The truth was out, the machine exposed. That was the victory I had fought for. Still, when evening fell and the first numbers trickled in, my pulse betrayed me. I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, phone face down on the table, and stared into the dark until the silence was interrupted by a single vibration. It was Michael Tran. I stared at the screen for a moment before I answered. He didn't waste time on preamble. "Mr. Marlowe," he said, his voice clear, edged with disbelief and something that sounded like pride, "Congratulations. You've just been elected mayor of San Diego." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I stood in the center of the room, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding in a rhythm I didn't recognize. The words didn't land all at once. They hung in the air like dust after an explosion, settling slowly, rewriting the reality around me piece by piece. I had won. Not just a seat. Not just a title. I had won the one thing they said I would never have, the power to change the story. I remembered my mother's voice, cold and certain, "You're not capable." I remembered my father's finger pointing past me to Nathan. "He has the edge. You don't." And yet here I stood. Not because I played their game better, but because I refused to. They built a world on control, on silence, on fear disguised as structure. And that world had collapsed under the weight of its own rot. The people they had tried to deceive chose the one son they had cast aside. Not for his pedigree. Not for polish. But because I had looked them in the eye and told them the truth. And in a city starved for honesty, that was enough. I ended the call, still frozen, still absorbing. Outside, the streets were erupting, not in chaos but in something alive. Car horns. Cheers. Laughter. My name on signs I had never printed. Messages lighting up my phone from names I hadn't heard in years. But none of that noise reached the place in me where the real reckoning lived. I thought of Ryan alive. Of Leah, finally free from a cage wrapped in pearls. Of Nathan, now stripped of the invincibility they'd built around him like armor. And I thought of my parents, somewhere in their fortress watching the empire they thought eternal slip through their hands. They hadn't just lost control. They'd lost their illusion. And I, once the failed project, the quiet disappointment, stood now not as their heir but as their undoing. The morning after the election I sat alone in my new office at City Hall. The air still smelled of fresh paint and old paper, as if decades of power and silence clung to the walls. I hadn't even touched the ceremonial desk yet. I didn't need to. There was one task left. One final cut that had to be made. And it wasn't political. It was personal. I called my legal counsel at 8 a.m. sharp. My voice was calm, rehearsed not in tone but in conviction. I instructed them to freeze all disbursements from the Marlowe family trust effective immediately. That included travel budgets, discretionary funds, auxiliary spending accounts, and the two primary channels my parents and Nathan used for their monthly expenses. The accounts were extensive, layered in financial camouflage, designed to mask excess as necessity, to make dependency look like structure. But I knew where they were hidden. I knew what lines to sever. There was no drama in the execution. Just signatures, authorizations, and quiet confirmations. One after another, the pipelines dried up. Private drivers, property managers, corporate cards, board stipends, all suspended. The empire didn't collapse with a roar. It bled out in silence. When the final document was signed, I opened a blank page, typed a brief letter, and sent it to my mother's personal email. From this month forward, you will cover your own expenses. This is called responsibility. No greeting. No closing. Just the words they had taught us all to fear now turned back on them. For a few hours there was nothing. Just the hum of the city, the rustle of movement outside the tall windows, the distant rhythm of car horns and footsteps in Civic Center Plaza. But by early afternoon the silence broke. The first message came from her. "Ethan, please don't do this. You don't understand what you're doing." Then another. "Your father needs access. There are medical costs. We're asking you, just listen." And then Nathan. "Is this punishment? You think this makes you stronger? You think you're better than us now?" I stared at the screen, at the wave of desperation folding over itself in real time. I saw the language change. First control, then pleading, then insult, then silence again. But I didn't answer. I didn't type a single word. Because there was nothing left to explain. They had built a life where dependency was control, where every act of generosity was a chain, where love came with price tags and contracts. They had fed off the illusion of benevolence while ensuring no one could survive without their approval. Now for the first time they would have to live by the standard they had enforced for years. Independence. Responsibility. Consequence. The irony was almost poetic. Cutting them off wasn't revenge. It was liberation. For all of us. They would no longer bankroll silence. No longer buy loyalty. No longer sustain a fiction with money that came soaked in obedience. I had been told my entire life that family was everything. But they had redefined that word until it meant ownership, debt, obedience disguised as love. And if that was family, I wanted no part of it. I didn't freeze the accounts out of spite. I did it because I finally understood the difference between a root and a chain. And I was done being held underground. The aftermath didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came slowly, inevitably, like the tide pulling back to reveal everything buried beneath the surface. One by one, the foundations they had built on fear and image began to collapse. Not from a single scandal or a headline, but from the unbearable weight of truth finally allowed to breathe. My father's consulting firm, Marlowe Strategies LLC, was the first to fall. Once untouchable, once whispered about in conference rooms and closed-door summits as the engine behind dozens of campaigns, it filed for bankruptcy within weeks of the election. Creditors surfaced, invoices long hidden under shell accounts were unmasked, former employees turned witnesses, and the firm was gutted from the inside by a federal investigation that unraveled everything. Not just the financing of Nathan's campaign, but years of strategic laundering, backdoor dealings, falsified lobbying disclosures, and donations funneled through community initiatives that never existed. He tried to hold on, tried to outlast the storm by calling in old favors, but no one answered. Silence followed him where applause used to be. The power he once carried into every room with the subtlety of a storm had dried up into irrelevance. Nathan disappeared from politics. There was no announcement, no apology, just absence. His face vanished from banners and news feeds, his team dissolved, and his polished charisma became a relic no one wanted to touch. I don't know where he went, and I didn't ask. The game he had been bred for had finally chewed him up and spat him out, and whatever was left behind, it wasn't the version of him my parents had tried to engineer. Without the machine propping him up, there was nothing left for him to represent. My mother lost her influence even faster. Her invitations stopped arriving. Fundraisers declined her calls. She had once been the architect behind so many behind-the-scenes alliances, able to shift loyalty with a glance, to decide who rose and who was silenced. Now her network collapsed like a house of cards built on obligation, not respect. And when the silence reached her too, I knew she finally understood what it meant to be outside the system she spent her life commanding. But I didn't watch them fall with bitterness. I didn't savor it. The truth is, by the time it all crumbled, I had already stepped away. I had begun a different life. Ryan came back to himself in slow pieces, as if recovering from a long illness. He returned to his music, but this time not hidden. He submitted his work to galleries and artist collectives without our family's name attached, and people listened, not because of his bloodline but because of his voice. One evening, I stood in a white-walled gallery in Santa Monica, surrounded by strangers moved to silence by the sound of one of his compositions echoing through the space. His name was on the wall now. Not as a son. Not as a disappointment. But as an artist. Leah walked away from everything that once tethered her to our parents' designs. She ended her engagement to Lucas in a single phone call, packed her things, and rented a cramped office above a print shop in North Park. Within weeks she had launched her own firm, small, fierce, and unapologetically focused on cases that most others wouldn't touch. She specialized in financial abuse, helping clients break free from coercive control structures, from partners and families that used money as a leash. She called it red line legal. She told me once that every time she argued in court, it felt like reclaiming oxygen. And me, I learned to live in truth, not theater. Politics no longer felt like a stage or a battleground. It became a service, stripped of the illusions I had grown up inside. I kept walking the city. I kept meeting people. I learned names, listened to stories, passed laws that mattered because they were built on human need, not optics. I declined every gala, every photo op I didn't believe in, every offer that smelled like the old world I had left behind. I didn't want a throne. I wanted a mirror that didn't lie. And somewhere in that stillness I understood what victory actually meant. It wasn't the office. It wasn't the headlines. It wasn't even the justice we had carved from the wreckage. It was freedom. Freedom from fear, from legacy, from expectation. Freedom to exist without permission. I remember those words my parents said to me, their voices seared into memory like scars carved by certainty. You're not capable. And now, standing at the end of everything they built, I see it for what it always was. Not prophecy. Not truth. Just fear. Their fear. Of what happens when someone like me stops being afraid of them.